Hi there, my name's Helen and I teach Latin and Classical Civilization at Woking College. Thank you for joining me for our Latin taster session. We'll have a little overview of what the A-level actually covers, and then it's quite an ambitious task, but we're going to try and have a little taster of each of the strands that you'll do at A-level as well. So let me share with you the PowerPoint we'll be looking at. So that's my email address. If you do think of any questions at all at any point, feel free to send me an email. It's hri@woking.ac.uk. The first thing to say, for those of you listening, now you may be in different year groups. You might be in year 10 or year 11, and I'll be addressing that at different points. In order to do Latin A-level, you do need to have already done Latin GCSE. That's standard amongst languages because, of course, we're building on the subject that you've already studied. So let me give you a little sense of what we cover. So you have 4 strands, 4 papers. One of them is unseen translation, which hopefully you're used to from GCSE. The second, you have a choice. We're going to practice composition today, but you can do prose composition, which is learning to translate essentially backwards. So rather than translating from Latin to English, you're going from English into Latin. The other option is comprehension. Every year I give the class the opportunity to decide which of those 2 they want to focus on. So comprehension questions are questions to gauge your understanding of a text, and they include questions on grammar and syntax, just so you're aware. And then we have 2 bits of literature. Now, depending on the year group you're in, you'll be doing different bits of literature because they cycle through the text, they change it every couple of years. So you always do verse literature. I always choose to do Virgil for the verse, so we'll be looking at a little bit of Virgil together. And then prose literature, and I always choose to do Cicero. So again, we'll be looking at a tiny bit of Cicero. Because this is quite ambitious, there are likely to be points where we don't cover everything together. So if you do want to carry on through the work I've given you here and send me anything that you've had a go at, feel free to do so. So we're going to start off looking at unseen. Hopefully this is the element that you're most familiar with. I've put a passage on the next slide that is roughly GCSE standard. What I'd like you to do, if you've got some vocab as well, what I'd like you to do is to pause the video once you've got the passages there, have a little go at translating it yourself, and then play again once you're ready to go through the translation together. So here's your little text. It's the beginning of a story about Helen of Sparta, perhaps more commonly known as Helen of Troy. So pause here, have a go at translating that, and come back when you have got your translation to check. Okay, let's go through this together then. So Helena mater erat Leda. That's Helen's mother was Leda. Uxo Tyndarii, the wife of Tyndareus, Lacedaemoniorum Regis, king of the Spartans. Now, something that is a little bit tricksy about this, and I don't know if you fell into this trap, the examiners love setting this, is that the first word in that sentence isn't in the nominative. So we can't keep that as our nominative in English, it would be wrong. Helena is genitive, so you have to make sure that you've shown that genitive as well. So don't beat yourself up if you didn't spot that, but do bear in mind to look out for that in future. Pater Jupiter ipse fuisse dicitur. Jupiter himself, that's where Jupiter ipse, dicitur is said, fuisse to have been, pater, her father. Now hopefully something you're quite used to doing already is inserting little words such as a or the or his or her as it sounds natural in English, because a lot of the time, certainly for the articles, they'll never be in the Latin, there isn't such a thing. And for the possessive pronouns, they're often not included unless they're emphatic in Latin, but they sound much better in English. So do add in words to make sure that the English sounds good. Rex enim deorum, for the king of the gods, ubi Ledam in flumine natantem vidit, when he saw Leda swimming in the river, Ea maniopere amavit. He greatly, like in a great sense, fell in love with her. Itaque in formam cicni albi severtit, et ledam rapuit. And so he turned himself into the shape of a white swan. It's quite a strange thing to have done, but we can talk about that later. Et ledam rapuit, and he seized Leda. Because this is kind of meant to be a GCSE passage, that the actual moment of conception is censored. We move past that. Leda non infantes, sed duo orva alba perperissa dicitur. So we've got that word dicitur again. Again, we're going to treat it as an impersonal passive. Or we can treat it saying Leda is said, or it is said that Leda. So Leda is said to have given birth to, or to have produced, not children, but 2 white eggs. I dread to think about the biological status of that, but there we go. Horum, of these, ex altero Helena et Pollux, from one, Helena or Helen and Pollux, et altero, from the other, Castor et Clytemnestra, that's Castor and Clytemnestra, nati esse decuntur, are said to have been born. So it's quite an unusual beginning, although if you've read into Greek myth at all, you get used to the unusual happening. So we've got bizarre things, but this is mythology. It's setting them apart. You do need to get used to strange things happening in translation passages, don't you? This is a useful preparation. Helena erat virgo pulchritudinis praestantissimae. So Helen was a maiden or a virgin or a young girl. Then we've got these genitives. So again, you want to convey that genitive of outstanding, or of the most outstanding, whatever you can do to convey that superlative. Pulchritudinis, beauty. Omnes principes Graeci, all of the leaders or chiefs, all of the Greek leaders, ierunt, went ad regiam Tyndarii, to Tyndareus' kingdom. Neque Tyndareus inter eius diudicare potuit, and Tyndareus could not decide between them. Tandem Ulixes, at last Ulysses or Odysseus, princeps Ithacae, whose leader or maybe king would work, of Ithaca, qui non Helenam sed Penelopeam in matrimonium ducere volebat, who did not want to marry Helen, but Penelope instead. Consilium bonum Tyndario dedit, gave Tyndareus a good advice or a good plan. So I hope you got on all right with that. If you found bits of it tricky, it's worth asking yourself if you've got repeated mistakes. Maybe you weren't spotting case endings, or you weren't spotting passives are quite easy to miss sometimes. So have a look at the areas that you can then start working on, because the more you can do to identify that and improve, the better. So that's our little unseen. We're going to carry on looking at that same story, but this time we're going to look at it in prose composition. So here we've got English that we're going to try to translate into Latin. Now I'm going to preemptively apologize, because I'm going to try to annotate on the screen for you. It's going to look even worse than my handwriting does on a whiteboard, so I'm sorry about that. But I'm going to show you the process that you need to go through. We're not going to go through all of these together, but then if you wanted to send me your go, you could do that, and I could send you some feedback. So the way to approach this is to firstly assure yourself that this is a process you can learn. It initially feels like you underestimate it and then you overestimate it. That's the normal process. But we're going to read the English, and we're going to decide firstly where our verb is, and then secondly what cases we're dealing with in terms of the nouns. So in this first sentence, Helen was the daughter of Leda and Tyndareus. So here the word was, oh apologies, that didn't work, did it? In which case you're not going to get annotations. I should just talk you through it. Helen was the daughter, so our verb is was, so I'd underline that. Then I'd have a look at the cases. So who's doing the verb? Helen. Therefore, she's our nominative. And we have a second noun that is, again, talking about Helen, daughter. So that's going to be nominative as well. Then we're left with of Leda and Tyndareus. Now, those would both go into the genitive to show possession. That's your prep. So you need to do that initial preparatory work before you then decide to put it into Latin. So then you would go, okay, Helen, what's Helen in Latin? In the nominative, Helena. This time we can put the verb next because the verb was can go in the middle. So we'd say erat. That's your third person singular imperfect from the verb to be. Then we'd want the word daughter, again in the nominative singular, filia. So we've got Helena, erat filia. Then we'd want the genitive singular of Leda. She's a first declension, so that's going to be ledai. And Tyndareus, et Tyndarei, because Tyndareus is a second declension, so his genitive singular ending is an I. That's the process you'd go through for all of these. Now, there are some other elements to be aware of. For example, in the second sentence, you've got the Greeks came to Tyndareus' kingdom wanting to marry Helen. That word wanting is a present participle, so it has to agree with something, and that would agree with the word for the Greeks. So you would make it masculine, plural, and nominative. So things like that, look out for agreement. Tyndareus said, Helen, I want you to choose your husband. In that speech, you've got, I want you to choose your husband. You would have, I want, so that would be your first person singular present. Then you would be going into an indirect statement. Hopefully that's something you've covered at your GCSE. If not, you express that by having an accusative, so the word you would become te, and an infinitive, so the word to choose would be an infinitive. Then your husband would just be another accusative. Helen chose Menelaus, a son of Atreus. Hopefully that would be quite straightforward. Again, look at when you have nouns that are talking about the same person. So Helen, here would be your nominative, chose Menelaus, he's your accusative. Then a son, well, that's still Menelaus, so that's going to be accusative as well. And then of Atreus would be genitive. And then at the end, Menelaus and Helen were happy. So that word happy needs to agree with both of them. The rule is that if there is a man involved, then it becomes masculine. You could have 59 women in a room and one man, and it would still be masculine. So, patriarchy. So happy would be masculine plural. Then for many years, you'd want to use a temporal use of the accusative, which shows duration of time. So you wouldn't have a word for, but many and years would both be accusative plural. So if you fancy having a further go at that, then do send me an email with your attempts at it. As with the translation, don't beat yourself up if it feels difficult. You might have had a bit of a break from your Latin learning, or this could be something completely new to you. When we teach this at A level, we teach it as though it is new to everybody. That's enough language. Let's have a look at some literature. So the first bit we're going to look at is a little snippet from Virgil's Aeneid. I've taken a passage from book 4. What I would recommend is that when we get on the next slide, again, you pause it to familiarise yourself with the text. I've given you the Latin on one side and the English on another, and then there's some questions to consider above. This is probably the area where there's the biggest leap from GCSE to A level. So feel free at the minute to primarily focus on the English. That's completely fine, because you can then transfer those skills into the Latin. If you're feeling confident enough to have a little go at the Latin, you could always use an online dictionary to help you look up some words or see if there are any words that you can piece across. So here's your passage. Pause this for a moment and familiarise yourself with the passages and with the questions. So we're looking at Aeneas's character, how he seems to relate to Dido. We'll talk about that once you've read through it, and what this tells us about kind of gender stereotypes in the ancient world. So pause here, see how you get on. Let's have a look at these together then. Now, you may or may not have read any of the Aeneid. We don't assume that you've read any particular text, because you can study a wide range at GCSE. If you haven't read any of the Aeneid, no surprises, but Aeneas is the hero of the Aeneid. That's why it's called that. And partway through the book, he meets a Carthaginian queen called Dido, and they have a romantic relationship, but he then has to leave her. He's forced to leave her because he needs to go to Italy to found what will become Rome. So this is a moment where Dido, through her sister Anna, is desperately trying to persuade Aeneas not to leave. So we have various ways in which Virgil is encouraging us to view Aeneas. I don't know if you noted down any thoughts, but certainly pretty standard interpretations are that Aeneas seems really quite cold, and that's emphasized because we have the extremity of the pain and the grief felt by Dido and her sister, miserrima fletus, and then this idea that this is kind of the repeated attempts, ferque, which is predominantly or emphatically placed at the beginning of that line. They keep trying to bring this to his attention. Sed nullis ille movetur, but he is moved by none of it. So he seems possibly cold. The alternative to that is that he's very controlled, that he's holding everything in. And that is something that is then emphasized by this simile. It's a lovely simile. This idea that Aeneas is like an old, well-rooted oak tree, and that Dido and her sister are just like the wind battering at him, but none of it is it's not going to change him, and it's not really going to harm him, apart from superficially. So that simile can teach us quite a lot about the expectations of Aeneas as a hero. He is expected to be steadfast, to be fixed in his determination to meet his goals, and ultimately his goal is bigger than himself. He has this fate that supersedes his personal feelings. But you also have this sense that in the simile, Dido and her sister are in some way diminished to almost irritating forces that just batter at him and should be ignored, which I think is quite an interesting element when looking at the gender of this. Again, we're just scratching the surface here, so if you would like to delve into that in more depth and send me any thoughts, then do send me an email. And we're going to very briefly have a little snippet of one of Cicero's speeches. I've taken a tiny chunk of the second Philippics. So if you are currently coming to the end of your year 11, this is the text, or one of the texts, that we'll be studying together. It's a little bit of it. And it's a speech denouncing Mark Antony, trying to publicly shame him. It's quite fun. If you are in year 10, then you'll actually be studying a different text. You'll be studying the Procluentio, which is also a great text. It's a defense speech set within this family where they just all seem to be intent on murdering each other for inheritance. It's pretty exciting. But this is from the Philippics. So this is a little section where Cicero is standing and trying to publicly shame Mark Antony. So again, have a pause. You've got some questions at the top there. So think about how Cicero comes across as a speaker, how effectively he is insulting Mark Antony. Again, feel free to focus on the English if you want to, but pause and have a little read. Now, we're running short of time, sadly. I did say this was an ambitious amount to get through. You hopefully will pick up on the fact that this is pretty scathing stuff. Firstly, and I'm sure this is something that you would in no way have any comprehension of, but there's a tone of embarrassment at the beginning here where he's claiming, throughout the speech, he claims that Mark Antony spends the majority of his time being drunk in public. So that idea of, oh, well, you were at Narbo and you were being sick all over this feast, it's just to show that he's got no self-control. And then we have this incredibly scathing idea, ex omnium, omnibus flagitis. We've got lots of hyperbole here. Of all the profligate conduct of all the world, I never, ever saw anything as bad as you. He's really laying it on thick here. And we also at the end have this idea that He's even questioning Mark Antony's Romanness. He's saying that he delights in wearing Gallic slippers and barbarian clothing. How strange. So it's all designed to really undermine Mark Antony's status as a Roman leader. Hopefully not the sort of conduct we would see in modern politicians, although at times it can be an interesting parallel. So finally, and again, this is more applicable if you're in year 11, but if you're in year 10, this is going to be useful for you as well. What I recommend that you have a look at over the summer is focusing on your GCSE vocab. So either learn your GCSE vocab or relearn it if you've already completed your course. We'll have a test at the beginning of the year. So it's really worth you preparing that. And I'm not sponsored by any of these, by the way, but there are 4 really, really good resources and engines for creating revision materials. So hopefully you'll find those helpful. I hope you've enjoyed the session today. It was a really quick run through quite a lot of elements. As I've said repeatedly, do send me an email if you have any questions or if you'd like to share any thoughts. Enjoy your summer, and I look forward to seeing you sometime soon at college. Take care. Bye-bye.